People, churches, and religious communities and society as a whole have suffered through loss, anxiety, tears, and the absence of communal fellowship and physical prayers since the start of the pandemic. The Conference of European Churches' 7th Summer School on Human Rights, hosted by the Protestant Church in Germany, brought together church leaders, academics, and experts from international organizations and the European institutions from across Europe. The program explored how human rights, democracy, and the rule of law have been affected through restrictions in public and private life, and how such restrictions have affected the believers' communities and churches in Europe and beyond. What were the reactions of international organizations such as OSCE and the United Nations Initiative Faith for Rights on these issues?
It was useful as a tool for peer-to-peer learning, for literally exchanging experiences on how faith actors responded to the challenges of the pandemic and its impact on the human rights of their communities and followers and practices.
At the start of the pandemic, the OSCE leadership called on participating states to ensure that national minorities and vulnerable groups are adequately protected, and that it is made clear that discrimination and hatred will not be tolerated.
During COVID-19, European governments limited the right to freedom of religion or belief. Some traditions, like the Orthodox practice of the shared spoon, a centuries-old practice for receiving communion, raised the theological question as to whether communion, a source of health to believers, must now be seen as a source of disease. In some Protestant traditions, adapting to the new ways of worship has also proven to be a difficult exercise. What were the challenges for European churches in this regard?
There were fears that using a shared spoon for the communion could spread the virus easily.
The Church of Greece was asked to comply with the restrictions that were applied for all gatherings, and only individual prayer was allowed. But that was not accepted always by the faithful who reacted, who asked to enter the church, the temple, and pray in the way Christians pray.
In Sweden, the government and the health authorities started limiting the access to public places in March. Churches with a big number of people coming there started to close down.
It was a complete lockdown of the country, and also worship places, the churches were closed to the public.
People feel disoriented and they don't feel like the community because they cannot stay together and share a moment together.
For European churches and their partners, it was important to address the question of how vulnerable groups like religious minorities, people of color, migrants, and refugees have been affected during the COVID-19 pandemic.
COVID takes place, straight away you see a spike on social media of the far right. And again, there's this xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia which rises. And unfortunately, there is a correlation between the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
And one of the reasons is that somehow everybody was home and social media was the medium for everybody to express dissatisfaction and anger. And a lot of that got anti-Semitic connotations.
Black people or people of color in general have been disproportionately affected due to also, like the preconditions and also the pre-pandemic era. The availability of vaccines, accessibility to vaccine, and also there are other factors that makes it even more difficult. For example, in America, there is a kind of resistance of Black people to trust the medical institutions.
Also inside the European Union, for example, the conditions in the camp are very, very difficult. And if one of the main recommendations is keep a distance, how do you do that when you're 8 in a room of 6 square meters? How do you wash your hands regularly if the next bathroom, the next washroom is really used by 200 people and half a kilometer away? So that very clearly meant that there was a real danger for the life and health of this group stranded in refugee camps.
From the start of the pandemic and lockdowns, the rights of young people have been affected. How did these young people cope with the situation?
The long-term impact on the COVID-19 pandemic and its and related measures will, of course, needs to be analyzed and understood. However, the key issues and challenges that students, Christian groups were facing in Europe region and were brought to us included, first of all, unemployment and professional development, health, mental health and well-being, quality of education, the trainings, digitalization, social inclusion, and youth participation.
You know, if I could reflect from the Muslim community perspective, a lot of young people have taken it really, really seriously and try to follow regulation.
We saw many young people from our faith communities taking leading roles, doing voluntary work, being at front lines and providing supports to those in need, as well as creating new ways of working and being involved.
Freedom of religion or belief is often taken for granted. During the pandemic, governments, in implementing the COVID-19 related measures, often affected fundamental freedoms and rights. How have different communities dealt with the limitations of freedom of religion or belief?
All Christians, actually, we have to find new ways to keep on the tradition and to safeguard at the same time the measures the scientists recommend in order to keep healthy and to avoid spreading the coronavirus.
If I were to give the example of my church, the Romanian Orthodox Church, it is true that in these delicate moments, the church official television, radio, news agency, and newspapers, as well as live broadcast from each parish, from each community, spiritual conferences, and online prayers helped a lot the people experiencing separation and isolation. And I think the church has never communicated so much through these virtual means.
It's important to know that the Bulgarian government did not dare to propose the closure of churches and other places of worship during the state of emergency. Nevertheless, most of the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church in Bulgaria decided to go online during the state of emergency. The Orthodox Church continued its public worship in compliance with the required anti-epidemic measures.
During the summer school program, religious leaders expressed messages of hope, solidarity, and unconditional love for the future. What were the lessons learned during the pandemic?
We've got to move beyond that and learn not to criticize, not to condemn, but rather to assist. And if this pandemic and the virus and the challenges should be faced and overcome, it will happen when we're together and not separated.
What was always so self-evident, like the Sunday service, or various church events, or the many ways of direct relationships, outreaching, care, pastoral care, all of a sudden became so difficult and the longest time almost impossible. During the first lockdown, also the churches had to close their doors. But now the churches have implemented special protection concepts and many people are able to cope with this situation. We experienced how churches and congregations almost immediately invented new forms of worship and possibilities of encounter via the internet and social media. Yet we know after a year what we all are missing. And we know that churches and religious communities are an important factor and that they play a vital role, not only in times like this, to guide, accompany, and comfort believers, but also for the time after.
Let us pray. From many countries in Europe and maybe beyond we gather, now and in the days ahead of us. Coming from different backgrounds and situations, from times of greatest insecurity, times of tears and anxiety, we are here. Not like we had hoped for, and still shaken by what is happening to the people worldwide by this unforeseen pandemic. Yet we are not alone. We are together, listening, sharing, helping, and empowering each other. And above all, trusting that God is here with us, with all his creation, in suffering and in hope, when faith is strong and when it falters. God, lead us that we may stand firm in faith, not for our own sake, but for the world that is longing for healing, for comfort, for love, for justice.